So who are the winners and losers when international companies use third-party countries to bypass trade restrictions? Well, let's ask Joe Minarik. Joe is the Senior Vice President and Director of Research at the Committee for Economic Development here in Washington. Welcome back, Joe.
Thank you.
So we talked about some of the workarounds that companies are using. Talk about some of the blowback, though, that they're receiving.
Well, a company that tries to bend the rules, and sometimes you're working to the letter of the law, which can be tricky and can be dangerous. There's a reputational risk. There's the risk that rules will be adjudicated against you if you don't do things exactly right. And in this political environment, of course, trade is a very sensitive subject at the very highest national levels.
And obviously with the US-China trade war, we've seen a lot of sort of shifts in the global supply chain. So how much have countries like Vietnam and other countries really benefited from this trade span?
Well, the iron law here really is that the larger the tariff is, the more you can gain by avoiding it. So as a result, when tariffs, which typically on cross-border trade can be 2%, 3%, very low, go to the 25% that the United States has imposed, all of a sudden there's a lot of money available there for reducing the bill. And if you can find a way to take an import from China and characterize it as an import from Vietnam, or if you can have some of the transaction be treated as tariffable from Vietnam at a low rate instead of at a high rate from China, there is money to be gained. And you have to, of course, divide that among the players in the transaction so that everybody's happy and everybody complies.
Now, Vietnam did run into some hot water when it came from its steel exports. The U.S. slapped tariffs of as high as 456%, saying that there was only minor processing in Vietnam, but the origins were actually in Taiwan and South Korea. So for these countries that are really taking on this risk then, and these companies, what should they keep in mind when trying to navigate these loopholes that aren't necessarily illegal?
They better be very careful. You need good legal advice. You need good accounting advice. You have to make sure that you are in compliance. Of course, there has been a history of countries that have played fast and loose. In some instances where, for example, the United States has had some kind of a quarantine. Goods have been transshipped and records have been falsified as though they never touched the country that's subject to a ban. So you don't know how intense the enforcement is going to be for legitimate players who do not want to run the reputational risk. They've got to be very careful.
And what do we know about the standards that the Trump administration is using in determining the final cost of these tariffs?
At this point, they've been engaged in, of course, the tit for tat with China, and anything you do, I'll match. So the 25% rate became very popular, and the Trump administration opposed that on a volume of Chinese imports from China, and China used the same rate for imports from the United States. So it really is a flexible standard, and it depends on how tough people want to be. And we're now in a situation where this standoff between the United States and China is becoming a test of wills, and it's very hard to determine where it's going to go.
Now, obviously, with people now turning to these third-party countries, and obviously now that they're on the radar of U.S. authorities, what other alternatives are there beyond these third-party countries?
You can certainly try to find a way to have a third country import materials and then to assemble it. Then you get into the kinds of disputes of, well, how much of that value added in that third country really was local, as opposed to the value of the inputs. There have been examples in recent days where there's been a threat for U.S. tariffs on automobiles, which of course are highly complex and can have very complex supply chains, for material sources to be moved, for assembly to be moved. So really the sky is the limit, and the more complex the product, and again, the larger the tariff, the more money is on the table if the situation can be managed.
I'm sure companies will be treading very carefully. Thank you so much. Always good to have you. Joe Minarik there, Senior Vice President and Director of Research at the Committee for Economic Development.